This is Matt Coyne, host of The Cheap Seats. Thank you for listening to the following broadcast here on Public House Media.
Hey, it's Baxter Colburn here from Public House Media. Did you know that we just added a store here at Public House Media? No, I'm not talking about a grocery store where you can go buy apples or bananas or peanut butter, which are all fantastic, especially when peanut butter's on all of those. Anyway, we've added a store here at Public House Media so you can not only come and represent your favorite podcast network, but also represent your favorite shows as well, too. Just go over to thephmedia.com and look in the top right corner where you'll see the button that says Store. Click on that and you can search through all of our great products. Or if you go to our Facebook page, Public House Media, you can see on the left-hand side a tab that says Store. All of our products are listed there as well too. It's the new Public House Media store. You don't want to miss it. It is fantastic. Buy some of that great swag to support your favorite shows and to support Public House Media. Check it out today.
Hi, this is Emily.
This is Lindsay.
And this is Elizabeth,
co-hosts of Beauties and Headcanons here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Once you are done with this episode, we hope you'll come check out our show, Beauties and Headcanons, where we talk nerdy to you about fandoms, fan fiction, and all pop culture for nerds that you can think of. A new show comes out every Friday.
Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode of Beauties and Headcanons. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, as always, Daniel Poppie. I'm still me, I guess. Check out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If you like How to Write Good, but you've been thinking to yourself, you're like, man, I like this Dan guy. He's pretty cool, but I just either don't like his voice or I just want something more orderly that doesn't have as many, I don't have to listen to him go on tangents, or I just want something that's a little shorter that I can quick read or listen to. Well, read, I guess. I think that if you are thinking those things, which you're almost certainly thinking those things, because I'm thinking those things, so you've got to be, right? Because we all think the exact same. Then you should check out my website. It's danielpoppie.com. I'll be putting out a blog post a week because they're called blogs. Blog is a dumb word. I think it's not that hard to say, but it just doesn't feel good when you say it. Check out How to Write Good on Facebook. Got some stuff going on there. Like and share the posts that come out if you enjoy it. That is a big help to me. I'm going to keep on saying it until someone does it. Well, some people do it. I'm going to keep on saying till you do it. You know who you are. All right. Also, check out How to Write Good on Twitter. That's all up and going. So if you like How to Write Good, check out How to Write Good on Twitter, and you can tweet me, and I will respond to you. So, yeah. Please don't heckle me. How to Write Good is brought to you by Public House Media. Check them out on Facebook at Public House Media, or, well, it's not at Public House Media, let's be honest. It's just Public House Media. There's no ats on Facebook. Or you can go to their website, thephmedia.com, and you can get How to Write Good swag. I've got myself a t-shirt. It looks pretty good. You do have to get the correct color. Well, I mean, you know what? Any color can go with any color. Okay? You just do whatever you want. The word of the week, and we're switching up the word of the week. The word of the week is communication, okay? And you'll understand in a second. So the meaning of communication is exchanging information. And I thought, I like word etymology. For those of you who don't know what etymology is, it is the history of words. Now, I don't think word etymology necessarily helps us with the usage today. So it doesn't help us see a word and say, oh, I can use it this way. But I think it's just really interesting when you look at it. And maybe if you're a poet, you can use the meaning behind the word, so the history of the word, not the meaning behind the word, but the history of the word, and add it into your poetry so you have more layers going on. So the word of the week, as I just said, is communication. And what it means is the exchanging of information, which I also said. It comes from the French word, I can't speak French, so I'm going to butcher this. So if you speak French, I'm really sorry about that because you speak French, but I'm really sorry about it if I butcher the word because nobody wants to speak French. That's what the joke is. It's not a joke if you have to explain it. The French word is essentially the same. It's communication. I don't know how to speak French again. and that just means communication. But it comes from a Latin, and I thought that this came from a German root, because Latin and German aren't, well, they're from Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European, but they are not from the same root, Latin and German. So there's the Germanic and the Romance languages, and they all come from Indo-European, but they're separate at the same time. Just think of it as a tree, people. So it's from the Latin communicare, and it means to share, to divide out, or literally to make common. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So yeah, I'm going to be having the history of the word on here. And I think, I also have to tell you if I like the word or not. I like the word communication. It kind of rolls off the tongue. It has a specific rhythm to it. I enjoy it. All right, today we are going to be talking about, for our accidental essence, your reader. We're going to be specifically, if you're a writer. This is, let me go back a little bit. So we're going to be talking about how the reader is clueless. Now, the reader isn't actually clueless, of course, but I think it's good to remember that when you're writing, okay? So there's probably some people who are listening to this podcast who are like, yeah, I think that thinking about writing and learning how to write better is a good thing. And you may be saying, well, Dan, you don't usually, well, actually the whole entire podcast is about writing. So if you don't think I do talk about other stuff, but if you think that I don't talk about writing, that's not true. I talk about writing a lot. So if you're a writer, you should just think, just to help you remember, just remember the phrase, your reader is clueless. That'll help you remember everything about this podcast. Because remember last week we talked about this idea of how you have bits of information and you chunk it? Well, you are going to be chunking all that information under your reader is clueless. So when you think of that phrase, you'll remember everything about this podcast. I don't think it's actually going to work. Also, the word of the week and the logical fallacy of the week connect to our accidental essence. All right. So the first thing I want to talk about with this podcast is egocentrism. So if you've taken a Psych 101 class, or you've taken a growth and development class in psychology, you know what egocentrism is. For those of you who don't, egocentrism is this idea that you cannot take someone else's perspective. It's not that you're full of yourself. It's actually something usually associated with babies. So with babies, or little kids as well. Little kids, this happens to as well. With little children and with babies, they cannot take another person's perspective. Okay? So, for example, this is the classic example of egocentrism. You give a little kid a phone, and they talk on the phone to the person, and at the end of the call, instead of saying goodbye to the person, they wave, right? Because they think the person on the other end of the telephone line can see them waving. That's the classic example of egocentrism. Now, because they can't take the other person's perspective, they don't realize that that person doesn't see the exact same thing as them, all right? Now, egocentrism is actually something that continues on throughout your life. It's just not to the same degree. I'm sure there are individuals in the world who they are very egocentric and they're adults, and not because they are just selfish people. Just because you're egocentric doesn't mean you're selfish. It's just that you don't have the capability of seeing from another person's perspective. So they may not maybe it comes across as selfish, but I think selfish is something different, okay? Maybe it's the same. Maybe that's where it comes from. I'm not going to get into that. So when I do something, I often assume others know what I am doing. Or, man, I just butchered that. When I think something, or when I think a specific way, this is from my own life. I have certain thoughts in my head, and when I come across another person and I talk to them, I don't want to think they're stupid. I don't want to think they haven't assumed certain things or come to certain conclusions. Therefore, I just assume that they have the same set of knowledge as me. I think to myself, okay, this person is an intelligent person. I know about this fact, or I like history a lot. So when I come across people, I generally talk to them as if they understand history, but I'm becoming more aware that a lot of people actually don't understand history, or they're not as into it. My wife isn't really into history. She really doesn't care about it at all. She's a smart person, but she doesn't care about it at all. Like, she should. You should. She should care about history because it's important and because it teaches us about ourselves, but she doesn't care about it. So when I talk about her, maybe I do explain myself, but when I talk to her, when I talk to other people, there's been times that I talk as if the other person knows what I'm talking about. And this happens to a lot of people, okay? This happens to a lot of people, but the person doesn't know what they're talking about, right? If I talk to my wife and I just start talking about the fall of Rome, and I don't know that much about the fall of Rome, but maybe I talk about gladiatorial games in Rome, because when I was a kid, I thought that was really cool, so I read about it. So maybe I talk about that to my wife, and I talk about whatever I know about that, or I talk about the First World War, and I don't actually prep her. I don't give her the information she needs to understand what I'm talking about, and I do that because I already have the information. So I assume someone else knows, okay? So as a writer, this happens as well. If you are a person who does writing, you have a specific set of information you're working from. And when you use that information, you sometimes write in a way that doesn't actually assume the person doesn't know. Let me put that in a different way, because that was awful. You're assuming that the person knows the exact same thing you do. I think this happens especially when people are making up worlds, when people are when people are doing story building. And I think the reason that this happens when people are doing story building is because someone has built up all these ideas in their head. And this kind of goes back to the last podcast episode as well. Someone's built up all these ideas in their head. They built up this world in their mind, but at the same time, they can only hold about a little bit of that at a time. They can hold the whole idea of the world in their head, and they can probably move from piece to piece. But since there's so much information in that world, they either need to write it down to get all the pieces correct, which is what I do, or what I try to do, or they need to try to remember every single piece when they're putting it together. If they're just doing world building, of course. It could also be the case that when they're writing a story and they're writing about a specific character, they've got this idea of the character in the back of their head, and they think, oh yeah, this character's really confident, and this character really likes this, and this character really likes that, and this character, he's just going to go out and do whatever he wants. Or maybe the character is really deceitful. And the person who is writing, give me a break, the writer has specific ideas in the back of their head that are informing what's happening in the story. And they want the reader to understand the character in a specific way, but the character doesn't have the information she needs to actually understand that character in that specific way. It's kind of an obtuse way to get to it. I'll give you an example from my own writing, and I think that'll help. So I've got a character in my book, and I want to convey this idea that this character is really confident. I want to convey this idea that this character is kind of a playful character. I want to convey this idea that this character is pretty much capable of anything, right? Now, within my book, I've got a specific picture of the character in my head. Well, not within the book, in my head. Within my head, I've got a specific picture of the character. I'm sorry, I'm just rambling right now. And when I think about that character, I have a specific image, I have a specific way this character talks, and I have a specific way this character carries himself, and a specific personality that goes along with it. I am positive that there's an ideal of the character in my head. I cannot make that ideal perfectly clear to the person who's reading. Okay, my goal is to make that ideal perfectly clear, like that image of the character. I want what's in my head to be perfectly displayed in another person's head, but they don't have the same information as I do, right? They don't have that image in their head. They only have what I'm writing down. And at the same time, what the information that they have in their head, their personality, who they know, they're going to connect it to their own knowledge base, and they're going to be changing the character. When I was writing my book that's coming out this summer, The Ninth Hour, I became aware of this fact that people, as an author, you have these tons of ideas in your head, and to a certain degree, you're just trying to get people to understand exactly how you understand these things, but you're never going to get people to completely understand how you understand these things. Okay, this explains. So if you see a book-to-movie adaptation, and to a certain degree, I don't like book-to-movie adaptations because they give They give imaginations flesh, if that makes sense. I'll explain it, don't worry. They take ideas that are written in a book. So the biggest movie adaptation that I think that kind of ruined, it didn't ruin the book. It was done really, really well. But the biggest one that I think ruined the book for me in a way, like my imagination, how I imagined the book to be, is Lord of the Rings. Because Lord of the Rings, when you read it, there are, if you didn't have the movie, so I started reading Lord of the Rings, and I think I finished all of Lord of the Rings before the movies came out. And I can't remember exactly. Maybe I saw the first one before the movies came out. Maybe I saw the first one before I read all of the books or something like that. But when I was reading the books, before the movies came out, because I existed before the movies came out, I had specific pictures associated with different things happening in the Lord of the Rings. So it was described in a specific way, and as a reader, you create something in your mind, and it's your own private cinema, right? There's no other person who's reading that book and creating the exact same thing, because maybe they're focusing on one thing that you're not focusing on. Maybe when they bring up the idea of orcs, or maybe they bring up the idea of like Gollum in Lord of the Rings. If you don't know Lord of the Rings, you have no idea what I'm talking about. So you'll have to go see it so you have prior knowledge so you actually can understand what I'm talking about. But maybe they have a different picture of Gollum than you. Maybe they picture the hobbits a little differently than you. The best you could get out of those books before they actually were turned into movies was the pictures on the front. And that was really cool, because you'd kind of use those pictures on the front, but at the same time you'd develop your own pictures of what's going on in the books. And then when you make something into a movie, then those books are forever cemented. Those books are turned into as close to reality as possible, because you have the images associated with them, and you don't experience them the same way, if that makes sense. Whenever I read something, or whenever I think of something related to the Lord of the Rings, it always connects back to those movies. So it kind of ruins that aspect of what the book was, right? It ruins that interaction between the reader and the text. It ruins the interaction between what the writer wrote and what the reader's experiencing, because what the reader's experiencing without the movie is different than what the reader is experiencing with the movie. So, and the movie is prior knowledge, right? So that's connecting back to what we're talking about. The movie is just prior knowledge. So somebody reading a book somebody reading The Lord of the Rings who's never seen the movies, who is going to experience Lord of the Rings differently because of that prior knowledge. In the same way, you as a writer need to make sure you actually know your reader, so that the person you are writing for, your reader, understands what you're saying. In the same way, I can't just say whatever I want. I'm not capable of thinking in a way, probably. I could probably talk in a lot of big words. I don't talk in a lot of big words, so it'd be really difficult for me. I usually just try to speak plainly. I could talk about something that most people don't know about. Do I know anything most people don't know about? I could probably talk about educational stuff, and teachers would understand me, and nobody probably would understand me if I used like the terminology. And nobody would understand me when I'm talking about that. But like, what's the point? Seriously, it's also too much work. So when this can be applied, this idea of taking into account who you're talking to can be applied to pretty much any area of your life, right? And I think that people who, if you get immersed in something, so whatever field you're in, you're likely picking up terminology and ideas that aren't in other fields. And when you start to do that, I think I talked about in the last podcast, but I talked about those chunks that you make, those big, huge chunks. Remember at the beginning of this when I said your reader's clueless? That's the chunk you're going to grab onto. That's the idea that you're going to turn into a chunk. Or your chunk is going to be called that. But you create these chunks and you label these chunks. So in education, we have a chunk called intervention, right? And you could probably figure out what intervention is. But we have another chunk called differentiation. There's another chunk I just read about today, and I still don't know what it is, because the person who was writing about it could not clearly convey what they meant by it. And what the chunk was called data on purpose. Data on purpose. Based on what he wrote. Now, you might know what that is if you're a teacher, or you might know what that is if you're a statistician. You might know what that is if you deal with statistics a lot or deal with statistics in a business, but based on what he wrote, I have no idea what that chunk means. But you, in your field, you likely have some chunk. You might work in a stinking coffee shop, right? And you still have specific names for things that I don't know about. It's probably the case that if you are an adult, or even if you're a teenager, there are things that you know about that I don't know about, that you said them, I wouldn't understand them at all. I'd be like, I don't know what they're talking about. I think this comes up, I'm almost certain about this because I work with a lot of kids and they bring up things and I don't have an idea about them until I actually research them, okay? And it's not generally really complex things. So what you've got to do as just a general person is be like, okay, what does this person know? What's their field? What do I know based on where I work? What do I know based on my life experiences? Because there are certain things that within your life experiences you could have learned. So if you have horses as a kid, you are going to understand things related to horses more than someone who has never seen a horse in their life, right? You don't... A bit in a horse's mouth is pretty understandable, but there's other things related to a horse. If you've never, I just had a pain in my leg. If you've never, I still have it. I'm sorry about that. If you've never sailed, you don't know what a sheet is. You likely don't know what a sheet is, and you're probably going to misunderstand it. So I would just, if you've never sailed in your life and you don't know what a sheet is already, I just want you to quick guess what it is. I'll give you like 2 seconds. A sheet is the rope. Okay, a sheet is a rope, and you probably got it wrong because that doesn't sound right. It's a rope used in sailing. Okay, so when you're talking to anyone, and I feel like I'm getting off track right now. When you're talking to anyone, just make sure that you're speaking in a way or you're taking into account what they're saying. This is a type of empathy. All right. Empathy is being able to look from someone else's perspective. You're taking like a psychological viewpoint of their perspective. You're not feeling the exact same thing as them, but you're just looking from their perspective to try to understand them better. And if you empathize with someone before you start to explain something to them, meaning that you take their perspective and, what might this person know? You're going to be explaining that to them better than if you didn't. That's why I try to speak in plain English. When I write, I don't all the time. Sometimes I use words that just come to me or they sound good, or I'm trying to convey a specific idea, so I don't necessarily use words that are small. But the benefit of reading something is you can check in a dictionary, right? It stops for you. It goes along with your pace. Now, if I'm talking to somebody, I talk a lot faster than I write, and it's done in the moment. You're not going to go and rewind this podcast to understand what I said 10 minutes ago or even 3 seconds ago. You're probably not going to do that because it's kind of annoying. And that's why I don't speak in huge words when I do a podcast. So when you're writing, the same thing applies. You've got to actually empathize with the person reading. Try to be as clear as possible. Don't use terminology that people aren't going to understand. Don't use words that people aren't going to understand. Now, again, like I said, within reading, you can just open up a dictionary, so it's a little different. If you do use words that people aren't going to understand, there's got to be a reason for you using the words, either because it just helps the flow of the sentence. Now, you need to understand the word yourself. It needs to help the flow of the sentence if you're using it. It needs to convey a point you couldn't conveyed otherwise, and it needs to be specific. So there's certain words that other people might not understand, and the reason why I use them is because they're specific, right? There's not another word that means that. I want to mean the specific thing. There's a specific word to mean that thing, therefore I'm going to use that word. I'm not going to use something else that doesn't mean the same thing. I am trying to convey my thoughts as clearly as possible to someone else. All right, so I'm trying to make them understand best, and I'm trying to do it in a way that is as exact as possible. And there's some give and take with that. I mean, you could be very logical, and you could write something that is exact as possible in syllogisms. You can if, then, therefore, and logical format. If, then, that. If this happens, then this happens. It's essentially like computer code. So computer code is very logical, but most people don't understand it, or they don't understand it they don't understand it as much as a computer programmer would. Now, when you want to make it as you want to make it as specific as possible, but there's more to language than just specificity, right? There's the flow of the language. You want to make sure that you're not giving people too much information when you are talking to them. You want to make sure the rhythm of your speech is pleasing so that it's easier to understand, it's easier to hear. You don't want to make your sentences extremely long when you're writing, generally, because it's going to be harder for someone to understand. Some of this comes from the book I'm reading that I introduced to you last week. Another thing that Pinker talks about that I think is really easy is this idea of front-loading sentences. So there's two parts of a sentence. There is the front half, which has the noun, the subject in it. It's called the subject, and the subject it's anything that is modifying that subject as well. So if I have on the road, the ugly, fat man, that is the subject, because on the road, it all modifies the subject, okay? Then I have the verb. The verb generally starts the predicate. That's the first half of the sentence is generally the subject. The second half is the verb. Think of it like that if you don't know what I'm talking about. But if you front load everything, meaning that you everything is in the subject, so I have tons of modifiers in that subject clause. A clause is just a phrase within a sentence, or in a part of speech, like a section of text, I guess. And if I have tons of modifiers in there, in that subject clause, in that subject area of a sentence, and that is going to be a lot harder for someone to understand than if I put it in the predicate and I have smaller phrases that keep on modifying things. Okay, and that's part of clarity, right? And I'm not doing a very good job right now. I realize that. I realize I'm not doing the best job being clear because I'm a little tired. It doesn't help. It's always good to write really, really early in the morning for me, at least. So, I am a little tired. So this kind of goes back to what I talked about before. In a podcast before, I talked about this idea how I think this was the Octavarium podcast. I talked about this idea where I used to write really complex things, and meaning that I had tons and tons of things going on, and then I changed toward a thing that was focusing on one idea, and it was a lot more depth to it, right? And I think this is the same idea. If you have tons and tons of stuff going on, you're going to be really convoluted in how you're talking about it. You're not going to be really clear, like this podcast, right? No, I think that generally I'm pretty clear. I do go off on tangents, but that's the nature of speech. Speech and writing aren't the same thing. They aren't the same thing. I've tried it. That's when you read something out loud, it's different than you just talking. There's a different rhythm when you read something out loud than talking. I have a very hard time sounding as if I'm talking when I'm reading something out loud. Now the writing is it has a good rhythm to it. It sounds good, but it's just as different. Talking and writing are very different things. They are related, of course, but they are different things. And just because you can talk well, just because you can get a point across to somebody verbally, like orally, I guess, doesn't mean you can do it in written form. Okay? It doesn't mean you have the capability. You actually have to be taught how to write something. It's not just something you do naturally. But I think that going back to that complexity, it's either something that's a mile wide and an inch deep, or it's something that's about 3 feet wide and 30 feet deep, right? So this goes back to that because I think you're always going to get something more coherent, something that makes more sense if you are looking at just a single idea and expanding on that. Because good writing does focus around ideas. That the more I see it, the ideas in writing have to connect. Okay, and I'm just going to end off with a quick bit of advice with writing, and it's more of a principle of writing than just a rule. So I just had to read something for a class, the thing related to data on purpose. And the issue, I have to read this book for class, and it's not an anthology. Maybe it's an anthology. but it has a different author every single chapter, which is all right. I don't mind that. But for this chapter, the guy tried to introduce, and I'm not trying to make fun of him. I'm just trying to get a point across. The guy tried to introduce an idea of data on purpose, but he had 2 paragraphs for an introduction. He didn't mention it at all. Then he got to the 3rd paragraph, he mentioned it, but he never explained what it was, right? And then he mentioned it 2 more times in the entire paragraph. He mentioned this idea of data on purpose 2 more times in the entire paragraph. He didn't set up a structure for how it worked. He didn't say these are the parts or anything like that. He took about 3 or 4 sentences saying things about it, but he never defined it. He never gave a structure to what it was so that I could understand the rest of the rest of the chapter. And the whole entire chapter, I was trying to figure out how this connects back to this idea of data on purpose. Now I'm being British and saying data on purpose. I couldn't fully understand how it connected back to it. And when you're writing, you need to make sure that first, if you have an idea, you don't need to outright say, oh, you could do this. You could be like, this is my idea, and this is why it is my idea. You can have more finesse with that, but you need to make it central. You need to make it central, and you need to make one sentence connect to the other. Okay, if you're talking about watches, right, and you don't really, the reason why you have an introductory paragraph is so that you can set up this. You can fill in the gaps of knowledge that your reader has. Right? That is the purpose of an introductory paragraph. It's not just to say random stuff about something. It's to actually fill in the gaps of knowledge. This is something that I actually realized a few weeks ago. It's not to just say random stuff about it. It's to actually set it up so that your reader can understand everything else that's coming. Okay? So if you have a watch, and you're from a culture, if you're from a culture that has square watches, right? All they have is square watches, and no one's ever seen a round watch. And you want to talk about watches in another country that only has round watches. If you do not use your introductory paragraph to set up this idea that this society only has round watches, and you kind of explain why they do and what they do, then if you start talking about round watches without doing that, people are going to be really confused the entire time you're writing, because they're going to be like, oh, what's this connecting to? Maybe next week. I don't know if I'll get this. Well, next week is a guest. So next week is the guest for May. I've got an author on, a guy, he's written several different books. His name is David Stewart. So next week I've got him on. If you don't usually listen to that, check it out. But if I always talk about round watches and I never set it up, I never fill in those gaps that reader has, that reader's going to be confused the whole entire time. Okay? It's the same thing with the thing I read today. He didn't connect it. Okay? If you have one sentence, just read the sentences out loud. If they don't feel like they connect together, the reader is probably going to be like, how do those sentences connect together? Your reader should not have to make logical leaps to understand what you're writing. And I'm talking about myself here too, because sometimes I write and I read my stuff and I'm like, man, that doesn't seem to connect at all. All right, so that's all I'm going to say right now. Whew, I'm winded. Okay, the logical fallacy of the week. Did you notice how, first, before I go into the logical fallacy of the week, did you notice how the word of the week was connected to the subject? Communication, A. The logical fallacy of the week is also connected to the subject. The logical fallacy of the week is called the historian's fallacy, and it's when someone assumes that decision makers of the past had the same information and the same perspective as the people analyzing the decision in the present. Okay, so logical fallacy, we're looking at people making decisions in the past. Let's look at dropping the nuclear bombs on Japan. Now, someone in the present might say, well, they shouldn't have done that because this, and this. They might use information from 10 years after. Well, this actually would have, we see that this actually wouldn't have happened because we had a similar situation 5 years later where they didn't drop nuclear bombs and nothing happened, right? I don't know. I don't know if there's information like that, but somebody might say that in the present. Well, the person making the decision to drop nuclear bombs did not have the information. Eisenhower dropped the nuclear bombs. I think he did. I'm pretty sure he did. Dropped the nuclear bombs on Japan. I actually have to check that because I don't want to be wrong. And someone from the president saying that he shouldn't have done that for various reasons is not taking into account the fact that he did not have the same information as you. Okay, so that is the logical fallacy of the week, and it's a type of egocentrism, right? That goes back to the idea of egocentrism. It goes back to this idea that you need to understand the person that you're writing for. I'm not saying that you should just write whatever that pleases that person. I think that you should be the final arbiter of what you're writing, but you need to take that into account, okay? And if any of you were wondering if I actually planned this out where all these things connected, I actually didn't plan this out. It was a bit of serendipity. I believe that's the correct word for it. So I was wrong. It's actually Truman, who was president in 1947 at the end of World War II. And I believe he's the one who gave the command to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I almost switched this out. All right, so that's all I've got for you this week. Next week, David Stewart is on, so check that out. I don't know David Stewart. He is an author. He is an author. He also does things with guitars and different things like that. I actually discovered him. I found him on YouTube talking about different things related to stories. I thought he was really interesting. So yeah, check out that podcast next week. My name is Daniel Poppie, I think. This is How to Write Good. I'm pretty sure. Have a good rest of your week.